You are trading your life for money right now, and the exchange rate is a total lie. I didn't learn this from a textbook or a boardroom. I learned it through 47 years of being a private duty nurse, living inside the silent, echoing mansions of the wealthiest families in America during their most vulnerable months. I've walked the halls of those Greenwich estates with 7 bedrooms and rose gardens that required a small army of staff just to maintain the illusion of perfection. I've sat at their mahogany tables, but more importantly, I've held their hands at 3 o'clock in the morning when the house felt like a tomb and no one else would come. I watched 87 of them take their very last breath, and I'm here to tell you that most of them were profoundly, desperately miserable in ways that their millions couldn't even begin to touch. Don't get me wrong, money matters. I grew up during the Great Depression, and I remember my father losing his job in 1931. I know the bone-deep terror of lard sandwiches and not knowing if there will be a roof over your head next week. Money is a tool for survival, and it solves the problems of poverty. But there is a tipping point that comes much sooner than you think, where more money stops being a blessing and starts becoming a predator that eats your life from the inside out. Let me tell you about a woman who had everything the world tells us to want. Eleanor Vandermir. I cared for her from the fall of 1973 until the winter of 1974. She lived in a 12,000 square foot fortress in Greenwich, surrounded by a pool and a tennis court that she was far too frail to ever touch. Her husband had been a titan on Wall Street, leaving her a fortune that could last 10 lifetimes. Eleanor was 78 and dying of heart failure. But the physical pain wasn't what was truly killing her. It was the silence. In the 5 months I spent by her side, not one of her 4 children ever stepped foot in that house. Not one. Her daughter in California would send flowers twice, a cold, colorful substitute for her daughter's presence. But that was the extent of her family's devotion. Eleanor would sit in her sunroom, staring at a rose garden she couldn't walk in, and she would weep. She wasn't crying because she was dying. She was crying because she realized she had spent her life securing her children's financial futures while completely losing their hearts. Eleanor finally confessed the reality of her regret near the very end. She explained that during the years her children were young, she and her husband were obsessed with building their empire, working constantly to provide a life of luxury. They shipped the children off to boarding schools and summer camps, anywhere that kept them out of the way so the business could grow. They thought they were being responsible. They thought they were providing opportunities. Eleanor looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "Vivien, I traded my children for money they don't even want. I gave them everything except myself, and now I am dying surrounded by beautiful things, and I am completely alone." I was the one who held her hand when she died. Her children didn't even show up for the funeral. This isn't just one sad story. It's a pattern I saw repeated for nearly half a century. The mansions changed, the names on the checks changed, but the bone-chilling loneliness remained exactly the same. You are probably watching this because you are currently working too much, telling yourself the same noble lie Eleanor told herself, that you are doing it for your family. You think that once you reach a certain number in your bank account or achieve some goal of security, then you will slow down. You tell yourself that then you will spend time with your children, then you will call your parents more often, and then you will finally find the time to rest. I am telling you, as someone who has stood at the finish line with so many, that the then almost never arrives. I saw this clearly with Richard Harwood in 1982. He lived in a 23-room penthouse on Park Avenue with a view of Central Park and the real Picasso hanging in his living room. Richard was a self-made manufacturing titan who worked 18-hour days for 40 years to ensure his children would never have to struggle as he did. In the process, he was a ghost in his own home, missing every graduation, every wedding, and every birthday. When I met Richard, he was dying of emphysema, gasping for air through oxygen tubes, in a room that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. One afternoon, he grabbed my hand with a desperate, weak grip and said, "Vivien, I have more things than anyone could ever need, and right now I would trade every dollar, every property, and every painting for one more year with my wife." His wife had died 8 years earlier. They had spent their entire marriage planning to travel together when he retired. But he was always going to retire next year. Next year never came for her. She died of a stroke 6 months before his planned retirement date. Richard died 3 weeks after our talk, and his children, the ones he sacrificed everything for, sold the penthouse and the Picasso before his body was even cold. They didn't keep a single thing to remember him by. I want you to be brutally honest with yourself. How much of your life are you currently postponing? How many dinners have you missed? How many weekends have you spent staring at a screen instead of your partner's eyes? Every time you say, "I'm sorry, I can't, I have to work," you are making a trade. Someday is the most dangerous word in the English language because it allows you to ignore the reality of what you are giving up today. Scientists have proven what I saw at the bedside. Once your basic needs are met, more money doesn't make you happier. We chase it because we can measure it. We can't measure the value of being present for our kids' school play or a Sunday dinner. We optimize for the bank account and let the relationship slip away, only to wake up at 78 like Eleanor, surrounded by wealth and absolute silence. There were others, however, who figured it out before the clock ran out. Take Margaret Hennessy, whom I cared for in 1989 in a modest home in Stamford. By the standards of my billionaire patients, she wasn't wealthy, but her house was never empty. Her children visited every single week. Her grandchildren came over after school. Former students she hadn't taught in decades would knock on the door just to say thank you. Margaret told me they made a radical decision early in their marriage. They would never sacrifice time with their family for extra money. Her husband turned down a superintendent position, and Margaret turned down a department head role because those jobs would have stolen their evenings and weekends. They lived in a smaller house and drove older cars, but they ate dinner together every night for 34 years. They were present for every recital, every game, and every fear their children had. When Margaret was dying, all 3 of her children were right there, holding her hands and thanking her for the life she gave them. There is a profound difference between dying surrounded by people who love you and dying surrounded by heirs waiting for their cut. You might think you have no choice, but every executive and lawyer I saw make the wrong trade told themselves the same thing. They were wrong. People like Margaret had mortgages and bills too, but they were brave enough to say no to the money so they could say yes to the people. These were hard choices, but they were choices. In 47 years at the bedside, I never had a single person tell me they wished they had worked more. Not one. But almost all of them wished they had been home more. I think about James Whitfield often. a man I cared for in 1995, who was worth over $100 million, but was completely at peace. He wasn't bitter or lonely. His grandchildren adored him. When I asked him how he avoided the misery of his peers, he told me that at 42, his best friend dropped dead of a heart attack from working too hard. After that funeral, James calculated exactly how much money he actually needed to live comfortably, added a cushion for emergencies, and then he simply stopped. He stopped chasing the next deal and started coming home for dinner and coaching his son's baseball team. His partners thought he was crazy for leaving money on the table, and he told them that was exactly the point. He decided to leave money on the table so he could sit at the table with his family instead. James lived for 49 more years after that decision, and he told me that taking his time back was the best investment he ever made. I am 101 years old now. I don't know if I have years or just days left. And at this age, you stop pretending you have forever. I have watched entire generations make the same mistake, sacrificing their lives for money they never spend on happiness they never feel. I have watched families dissolve over inheritances that bring nothing but misery. You don't have to join them. You can decide today that you have enough. You can decide that your presence is far more valuable than your production. Dinner with your family is more urgent than answering that email tonight. I am not telling you to quit your job, but I am telling you to be brutally honest about what you are trading and what you are getting in return. Stop pretending that someday will arrive on its own. The people you love will not be here forever, and neither will you. James Whitfield calculated his number at 42 and gave himself 50 years of life instead of 50 years of work. What is your number, and when are you going to stop? I've said what I needed to say, and I'm very tired now. I just hope you truly listened. Your life isn't waiting for you in the future. It is happening right this second. Go live it while you still can. And if this message meant something to you, please consider joining our community by subscribing and sharing your own thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know that my years at the bedside helped someone choose a different path.